This video is on cognitive development in infancy and toddlerhood. So what influences our development of thought and of language? Specifically, we will look at Piaget's theory and the various concepts related to it. We'll also talk about infant memory, how language develops, and some of the theories behind language acquisition. So let's start first with Piaget. So Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who actually developed his theory of cognitive development by observing and questioning his three children. Piaget believed all children move through 4 stages of cognitive development between infancy and adolescence. Movement from one stage to the next occurs when a child reaches an appropriate level of physical maturation and is exposed to relevant experiences. During the first stage, the sensory motor stage, which is birth to 2 years of age, infants and toddlers think using their eyes, ears, hands, and other sensory motor equipment. By the end of toddlerhood, children can solve practical everyday problems and represent their experiences through speech, gesture, and play. The basic building blocks of the way we understand the world are mental structures called schemas. So schemas are organizational frameworks for making sense of our experiences, and they change as we develop. Our most basic schemas are those basic reflexes like sucking and rooting, but our later schemas are much more deliberate, much more creative, much more intricate. So for example, if you were to think of the season fall, right, what other things do you associate with that? Many of us might talk about the weather changing, the leaves changing. You might talk about Halloween, right? And so those things all form our schema, right? They're easily activated when we think of the term fall. Schemas change. As I said, they don't just stay the same. Assimilation is when we use an existing schema to interpret new information. So for example, if I were talking about fall, right? So fall starts in September and goes to December. But if you moved to the Southern Hemisphere and you were in those months, September to December, you might find out that it is not the season of fall there. It is in fact spring, right? Because Southern Northern hemispheres have opposite seasons. So that might be a little confusing because your schema for fall, right, is now kind of being called into question. You're trying to make sense of this. Well, no, it should be fall now. Fall is from September to December. Uh-oh, difference, right? And that's where accommodation comes in, where we change, we expand our schema to include that new information. So, well, you know, fall is September to December in the Northern Hemisphere, but for the Southern Hemisphere, it's March to June. And to think about that, right? Not part of your schema. So those are kind of the basics for our schema there. Object permanence. Object permanence is kind of one of the big accomplishments or milestones of the sensory motor stage. Object permanence refers to understanding that objects still exist even when you can't see them. And there's a link here if you want to check out a little example. So with object permanence, you know, we don't learn it all at once. At first, infants do not understand that objects still exist even when they can't see them. And that is why peekaboo is so entertaining for babies, because they think you have disappeared, you know, and you're reappearing. when you're hiding behind your hands. So it's something that's gained throughout the sensory motor stage. And actually, let's talk about the substages. So Piaget actually believed that the difference between a newborn baby and a 2-year-old is so vast that he actually divided the first stage into 6 substages. So the first stage is reflexive schemas. So those basic reflexes from birth to 1 month. So he saw those newborn reflexes like sucking, grasping as the building blocks for sensory motor intelligence. The second substage, primary circular reactions from 1 to 4 months of age, where babies are beginning to gain voluntary control over their actions through primary circular reactions, or repeating chance behaviors largely motivated by basic needs and typically centered around their own bodies. They have very limited anticipation of events at this point. The third substage is secondary circular reactions between 4 and 8 months, where babies' motor achievements like sitting up and reaching for and manipulating objects are strengthening through secondary circular reactions. So they're trying to repeat interesting events in the surrounding environment that are caused by their own actions. And object permanence is kind of starting in this next stage, the coordination of secondary circular reactions, or substage 4, between 8 and 12 months. So they're now engaging in intentional or goal-directed behavior. They're able to coordinate their schemes deliberately to solve simple problems. They're beginning to master object permanence, as I mentioned, and they're improving in their anticipation of events. They'll still make some errors. For example, the A not B search error is common at this point, which refers to how you can hide a toy under like different blankets, right? And if you hide the toy in location A a few times, right, and the baby finds it, but then instead you hide the toy under the other blanket, location B, right in front of the baby, and that's what one of the things the video clip shows. The baby will look for that toy where it last found it, as opposed to the new hiding place. And this is called the A not B search error, because they're searching in location A rather than in location B. So it seems that they don't quite have a full grasp of object permanence at this stage, even though they're kind of getting it in that they're bothering to look for the toy, but they're still struggling with actually finding it. So tertiary circular reactions, the 5th substage, 12 to 18 months of age, is where toddlers are beginning to repeat behaviors with variations and developing the capacities to experiment and to imitate many behaviors. At this point, they can perform an accurate A/B search, so they'll look for a hidden toy in several locations rather than just wherever they last found it. And then in the final substage, substage 6, 18 to 24 months of age, we reach mental representation. So this is where toddlers can create mental representations, internal depictions of information that their minds, or that they can manipulate in their mind. So this includes both images as well as concepts. They can also arrive at solutions suddenly rather than through trial and error. And this is evidence that they can mentally represent their experiences. They can also solve advanced object permanence problems involving invisible displacement. So this is finding a toy that got moved while it was out of their sight, as well as deferred imitation. They're able to remember and copy a behavior they saw someone perform when they're no longer present. This representation makes make-believe play possible as well. Although some of the cognitive attainments of infants fit within Piaget's timeframe, others actually emerge earlier than Piaget expected and do not develop together in this neat, stepwise fashion that he assumed. Consistent with Piaget's ideas, sensory motor action does help infants construct some forms of knowledge, yet they also comprehend a great deal before they're capable of the motor behaviors that Piaget assumed led to these understandings. Researchers like René Valiergian has actually demonstrated object permanence in infants as young as 3 months of age by using things like the violation of expectation method. So by what happens is the idea is infants will look longer at an unexpected outcome than an expected one. And she used this to demonstrate that infants understand several object properties. So with some of the things that she would do, she'd show it looks like a car is passing through a solid object, which shouldn't be possible. Infants will stare at that a lot longer than they will if a car is behaving as it should, right? Being able to not pass through a solid object and hitting it. It's kind of playing off of those expectations. And again, anything that's not fitting in with what we would expect to happen, they'll look at it longer, right? So not a direct measure, but we can't exactly ask infants what they're thinking. So a little trickier. So let's talk about memory. So kind of taking more of that information processing theories view, examining individual components of cognition with memory. So one of the interesting phenomena that has been documented is infantile amnesia, and that refers to the inability to remember specific events that have happened to us during those first few years of life. So we don't, it's not that we have no memory, but we don't remember specific events that have happened, right? We don't remember being born or learning, saying our first word, taking our first step, things like that. We don't know exactly why, but there are a few different possible reasons for this. First, it's been suggested that having an immature hippocampus is why we don't remember. The hippocampus is an important structure in our brain for taking short-term memories, particularly short-term memories that are episodic, memories for a specific event that's happened to us, and changing that, transferring that into our long-term memory storage. So very important part. It's still developing, so maybe that's why we don't have memories of those first few years. We also lack linguistic skills. And so using different retrieval cues, language-based retrieval cues to try and get that information out of our memory, to remember memories that were formed when we didn't have language could be another issue. And then finally, lack of understanding of self, right? We don't have that self-awareness, that understanding that, we are a being that can act on the environment around us. And so maybe that is why we do not remember. What do we know about infant memory? So a lot of research has been done by Carolyn Rovey Collier. She did a study using a mobile, those little toys, you clip them to a crib and they've got the dangling little zoo animals or whatever, right? And so what she did is she attached a string to several infants' ankles and to the mobile so that when the infant kicked, the mobile would move. And infants love mobiles. They love moving mobiles particularly. So she did 2 9-minute sessions of kicking with the infants. 3-month-olds could remember a week later on their own, and they tested this by putting the infants in a crib with a mobile and, excuse me, and checking to see if they kick, right? They could remember 2 weeks later if they were prompted by moving the mobile. So, you know, they're not kicking, and so the researcher goes over and taps the mobile so that it starts to turn, and then the baby would start kicking, right? So these retrieval sessions had to be very similar in context or the infants wouldn't remember. So they needed the same mobile, they needed the same crib, right? With 6-month-olds, they could retain the memory longer, and they also needed less retrieval cues. So definitely showing that, you know, our memory does improve, and we are capable of memory even very young, but not really so much of those specific events that happen to us. Finally, deferred imitation. This refers to imitation of actions after a time delay. So seeing someone do something and then imitating, copying that behavior yourself after it's been a while since the individual did it. This has been seen possibly as early as 6 months of age if they get to practice. At 1 year of age, they're able to remember for 4 weeks without practice. Let's talk about language. Language, it starts out very, very basically with pre-verbal, pre-verbals, things like crying, facial expressions, gestures, and body posture. And newborns are capable of these things. But in terms of, you know, really kind of moving on to the next stage, really getting those speech sounds, that is at the cooing stage. So this happens around 2 months of age, where babies are able to make vowel-like noises. So oohs and ahs, things like that. Babbling happens around 6 months of age, and that's where infants will repeat long strings of consonant vowel combos. So they might say ba 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 ba, right? Around 7 months, babbling will start to include many sounds common in spoken languages. By 8 to 10 months, it reflects the sound and intonation patterns of children's language community. So remember, at first, we're able to hear and produce all sounds from various languages, but as that, and that's due to that exuberance, right, that synaptic blooming. But then after the synaptic pruning process, it's a lot harder, right? We're not able to hear and produce the sounds of languages that we're not regularly exposed to. So by 8 to 10 months, reflecting sound and intonation patterns of your language community. In babies who are hearing impaired, their speech-like sounds are greatly delayed. And in infants who are deaf, they will actually stop making those sounds. However, if deaf infants are exposed to sign language from birth, they will actually babble with their hands, which I think is really neat. So with first words roughly around the first birthday, and that, you know, is typically a noun. If you're a native English speaker, typically your first word will be a noun, something, a person, place, or thing, something that you've regularly interacted with. Mama is a real common one, or ball, you know, things of that nature. Chinese, if you're exposed to Mandarin Chinese, however, your first word is likely to be a verb. And that is because of the different emphasis the types of speech are given within different languages. Holophrasic speech, that is where children will use one word to signify a full expression. So a child might say juice, and it means they want some juice, or they want more juice, maybe if they've already finished their juice. But typically, adults who regularly interact with them are able to figure out what they're meaning, even from just a single word. And then the next stage, telegraphic or text message speech. Once infants have, well, I guess kind of more toddlers at that point, once they have 50 to 200 words in their vocabulary, they'll start to use these short little 2-word sentences, or, maybe 3 very short little sentences without any of those extra like conjunctions or adjectives. So for example, one of my nephews, when he was really young and he entered this stage, he'd always say, "Outside, go," meaning that he wanted to go outside. We could understand what he wanted, but it didn't have all the other words like "I would like to go outside," right? Way too complicated. So young toddlers, they will add to their spoken language vocabulary at a rate of 1 to 3 words per week. But during the 18 to 24 month period, children will have this huge increase in vocabulary where they might add 1 or 2 words per day. And this is sometimes referred to as the naming explosion. So yeah, really interesting to see that progression, and then finally into full sentences. So while we're learning to speak, we often will make errors. So underextension is an error in which children will learn a word and then apply that word too narrowly. So for example, sometimes children, they'll learn the word mom, right? But they only think, their mom's name is mom, and they have trouble understanding that mom, other people have moms too. They're like, no, 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 they're not mom. They're clearly something else, right? So too narrowly using a term. However, the more common error is actually overextension, using a word too broadly, right? Overgeneralizing a word. And that is shown, an example of that might be, if they were familiar with dogs, right? And then they see other 4-legged furry animals, they might also call it a dog. So that cat, it's a dog. That goat, it's a dog, right? That cow, that's a big dog, right? So they might just call it lots of things, right? A dog, because they don't yet fully understand. And so it's really showing how sensitive, how aware they are of categories. They also illustrate the distinction between a child's language production and language comprehension. So language expression, the words or production, the words that children use, language comprehension, the words they're able to understand, which at all ages, language comprehension, words they can understand, develops ahead of production, the words they can actually use. So getting into infant-directed speech. Adults in many cultures will speak to babies using what is known as infant-directed speech. And this isn't the same as baby talk, like, do you want to boochie, boochie, whatever, right? This is referring to speaking in short sentences with high pitch, exaggerated facial expressions, very clear pronunciation, distinct pauses between your speech segments, and repetition of new words in a variety of contexts. And if you want to see what infant-directed speech is like, think about how you might ask someone your age if they would like a cookie, and think about how you would ask a child that, a very young child, right? If they're another adult, right? Do you want a cookie? Versus how you'd say it to a young child. Would you like a cookie? Right? We say it in this goofy kind of way, right? Again, the higher pitch, exaggerated facial expressions, clear pronunciation. And children do prefer this. They're more likely to listen, to pay attention when you're talking to them in that fashion, and that helps them learn language. Um, and parents who are deaf use a similar style of communication when signing to their infants who are deaf as well. So this use of infant-directed speech helps to build on communicative strategies, things like joint attention. When I'm looking at something, you're looking at it, we're talking about that object, turn taking in conversations, and really how sensitive the caregiver is to a toddler's preverbal gestures. So parent-toddler conversation strongly predicts language development and reading success during the school years. So incredibly helpful for children. Talk to them. So the theories. Theories of language development. Linguist Noam Chomsky's nativism theory regards language as a unique human accomplishment that is innate, so inborn, where we don't, it's not something we learn, but rather something we discover, at least according to Chomsky. He believed that children are born with a language acquisition device, an LAD, that includes a universal grammar that underlies all human languages. And this permits children to understand and speak whichever language they're exposed to in a rule-oriented fashion. So again, it's discovered rather than learned because of that deep structure, how an idea is represented in the fundamental universal grammar, as opposed to the surface structure, how an idea is expressed in any one particular language. So definitely one view. Skinner and Bandura, on the other hand, definitely emphasize nurture, those experiences, more than Chomsky, who very much is putting that emphasis on, it's genetic, it's inborn, right? That nature side. So B.F. Skinner, he's the one who came up with the term operant for operant conditioning, believing that we learn everything, including language, based on the consequences that we receive. So he said we learn language because we are reinforced for making sounds, attempts at communication. And we learn it in this process called shaping, which is where we're rewarded or reinforced for closer and closer approximations to the target behavior. So target behavior in this case being full conversations. So we're rewarding an infant with attention and praise when they start, making those pre-verbal gestures, when they start cooing and babbling, and then when they say their first word, right? Whoa, lots of attention and praise. Say this, say that. Oh, good job. Wow. And really, getting them reinforced and moving them through those stages until they finally get to full grammatical sentences. Albert Bandura emphasized the importance of language, or of observation and imitation, in order to learn language. So he's also in that behaviorist view, but putting an emphasis on social learning, where we very much learn through watching others, copying others. So which theory is right? We do have evidence for various theories. Nature does prime us to learn language, although evidence for a language acquisition device has not been found. However, our brains do have dedicated language areas or speech centers, and that is Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area responsible for speech production, being able to actually say words. Wernicke's area responsible for speech comprehension, being able to understand words and to produce understandable sentences that make sense, to convey meaning. There's also been questions raised about whether we have to be exposed to language during what's known as a critical period. where learning can easily occur and needs to occur in order for typical development to happen. And many think that it exists for language, which uh, supports the influence of nurture. So for language, the critical period seems to be between infancy and puberty. And where this is coming from are some case studies, um, because we clearly cannot slash should not um, deprive children of language early on. I mean, would be very damaging. And so this is one of those instances where case studies are helpful, where a rare phenomenon has occurred, and we study it to try and learn more. Um, so two cases of children who were not exposed to language before puberty. One, Victor of Avignon. He was considered a quote unquote wild child, in that he was feral. So he seemed to have just been living in the woods. They don't know how or why he was. He was captured when he was digging around for roots in a vegetable garden. And they tried to rehabilitate him to teach him language because, again, he was completely feral, running around on all fours, naked, um, nonverbal, um, and they tried to teach him language, and he did learn some language, but he couldn't really put together sentences. He understood some words, he could say some words. Um, the other major case, excuse me, the other major case study, which was a bit more recently, I believe in the 70s, I'd have to double check, the case of Jeannie. Jeannie, horrible case where she had been isolated from infancy. Her parents kept her locked up into a toilet. She was fed, but there were indications that she was beaten for making any sounds. A neighbor tipped off the authorities, and she was removed from the house. She was about 12. She couldn't walk quite right, very hunched over. She couldn't speak. And they again tried, various researchers tried to rehabilitate her, tried to teach her language, and she learned a few hundred words. She could understand as well as actually speak a few hundred words, but she couldn't carry on a conversation. She couldn't put together sentences. And so these case studies, again, we don't know for sure because it's only a couple of cases, but we think, right, there might be a critical period where if you're not exposed to language before puberty, you're never going to fully be capable of language, like you would expect a typical person to be able to hold a conversation, put together sentences. Um, Other research has studied children with hearing impairments, and children whose hearing loss was identified and addressed early developed typical language proficiency, compared to children with impaired hearing that wasn't corrected until after 18 months. And those children had lower language performance into early preschool, although it significantly improved by 6 years of age. So even I mean, a relatively short period of time, first 18 months, causing severe delay. So is there a critical period? Quite possibly, where we have to have that exposure to develop it properly, um, but hard to say for sure. Also in support of nurture's role in language development is that children learn the language they're exposed to, and their language skills improve gradually. They imitate the word pairings that they hear, and they adjust their language when they receive reinforcement, praise, attention, getting the object they asked for. However, children also learn words too quickly to really be explained by learning through reinforcement. And they're also able to generate words they've never been exposed to. Some of those examples, they clearly know the rules, but they'll make errors like my toy car braked instead of broke, or I have 2 foot, or I swimmed yesterday, right? Words that they're not hearing from a social model, words that they're very unlikely to be hearing or reinforced for, which kind of puts a hole in those uh, social and learning theories. Social pragmatics sees language as more of a tool for interacting with others rather than as solely a cognitive skill. Children will use preverbal skills like gestures to communicate their needs, and others to their needs to others, and will make linguistic repairs when another person doesn't understand them. So um, various various supports for both nature and nurture, as well as that social component. So it seems like we need to look at various theories to fully explain language development. Okay, thank you.